This meeting is being recorded.
There you go. All right, so I'm going to back it up here and say that this week in solar news, we have a report from the EIA that's talking about how solar will dominate new generation capacity on the US grid for the next several years. We'll have more on that. Toshiba is testing a transparent solar module, which is quite interesting. And then some of the news here recently with Hurricane Ian was that the Americas, what they call themselves, the first solar city, took a direct hit from Hurricane Ian and did not lose power. So that's interesting to see and will be quite a nice little testimonial. Okay, I'm going to put you on. Okay, Devanan, could you mute? There you go. All right. So anyway, so EIA just released their report for the first half of 2022. And what they're showing is that the solar capacity increased year over year from 2021 to 2022, about 30%. In fact, the specific numbers of the change from 2021 to 2022 is that coal as a fuel source for transmission on the US grid dropped about 15%, still represents about 20% of the overall capacity, but it dropped 15% in this past year. Natural gas actually increased about 12%. They now represent about 44% of the grid. Nuclear didn't change. Hydro, actually, there were some additions in hydro, up about 16.5%, represents about 6.1% of the grid's production. It's kind of interesting with hydro because post-World War II, hydro represented about 90% of the grid capacity. It hasn't changed that much since the 1950s, but the percentage has declined. You know, the total capacities remain the same, but as a percentage of what's being used, it's declining. And then renewable grew at 29.5%. So now it represents about 12% of what's being produced by utilities and is available on the grid. There is another component with solar. They are starting to call it like small solar. This is user occupied distributed energy resources. So commercial, residential solar, it did grow about 21%. It represents a pretty small fraction of the electricity that's being used, about 1.5%. But that's growing. It's becoming more and more significant. So we really should add that into the renewable numbers. So if you throw in 1.5%, 12%, and 6% for hydro, you're up, you know, closer to 20% in the past year from renewables. Now, at the same time, FERC released a report. Now, FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And they're saying that it's basically still, when it comes to new capacity, a battle between gas, wind, and solar. You can see from these numbers for the first half of this year, about 33% natural gas. That's representing 62 generators that have been added to the system. 30 wind farms, essentially, 35% new capacity, and 255 utility scale solar arrays have been added in that represent about 31% of the new capacity. Yeah.
Have you got a chart up? Because all I see is pressing video.
Oh, I don't know. Oh, I see that. Yeah, let's see. Oh, you know what? Yeah, I do have a chart up. Okay, my technology is that no luck? I can see that window there. Why isn't that happening?
Yeah, I just said, mention it.
Yeah, no, I've got all this work on these cute graphics. Why isn't it? Yeah, now let's try this again. I'll start.
You're back.
Yep. All right, now you got me totally messed up. This is, you cannot minimize the screen. Okay. What do you mean I can't minimize the screen? I've been doing so well with all of this. Here we go. Okay, does that show up better there?
I just see you. I don't see any graph. There, maybe now. There we go.
All right.
Now we got it. Yeah, now we got it.
Okay, cooking with wind, with solar. Okay, so as I was saying, the FERC report is essentially saying that it's about 62 units of gas, 30 of wind. But the interesting thing about this report is that over the next 3 years, what they're anticipating is coal will continue to lose ground. They're anticipating we'll lose about 10% of the current generating capacity, that due to retirements. Natural gas is going to continue to grow, but at a relatively modest pace, 7.6% increase. Nuclear, a little bit. I think there's one turbine at one facility that's looking to be replaced or expanded. Hydro growing a little. Wind actually growing, but modestly compared to how it's done in the past. Solar is the big dog, right? 70% of the new capacity coming over the next 3 years, according to FERC, and FERC has been traditionally pretty conservative on all of this, is they're anticipating about 70% of the new grid connections will be solar. One interesting thing with these reports as well, and I thought I would dig a little bit deeper a little later in this call, is that electric prices have skyrocketed over the last year. We've seen overall an increase of about 15% in electric prices. This is 2021 versus 2022. Residential, the average residential price is now about 15.5 cents. Commercial, about 13 cents and a little. And industrial has gone up a little over 9 cents, about 9.5 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, what is the reason for this? And again, we'll dig a little bit deeper in this, but they're basically blaming the high cost of natural gas, the high cost of coal. I wanted to see, and I wanted to do some research to see if that is that legitimate. Is that a legitimate argument, or is this some of a little bit of price gouging going on? And I think we'll find it's a little bit of both. The Toshiba has tested some transparent solar panels, and what they've come up with, currently they're marketing it as a tandem cell, but they've got a top cell which is fully transparent, and it's not perovskite. It's a different material, but they found that they can get just that layer at about 9.5% efficiency, which is up from about 8.5% last year. But when they combine it with a silicon wafer in like a tandem solar cell, they're getting about 28.5% efficiency on this solar panel. So I think we're going to see a lot more of these, where these companies are trying to market as efficient, as clear solar panels, translucent solar panels. Okay. I see somebody freezing up, and I'm worrying that my internet is going unstable, so I'm putting a hotspot on just in case. Okay. Okay. So now the other thing in the news was that the direct hit from the hurricane, Babcock Ranch, which was touted as America's first solar panel town, took a direct hit by Hurricane Ian. They have about 700,000 solar panels. They serve about 2,000 homes. It's located just around 12 miles from Fort Myers, and they did not lose power during the recent hurricane. So that's quite a testimony to the resiliency, considering the strength of that hurricane. Is this town that had full solar, that's its only energy source, remained with power, while about 1.8 million Floridians lost power during this recent hurricane. So that's the news there. Does anybody have any comments on this? Well, on the solar news? Give everybody just a second. Everybody's being quiet. Okay, I'm going to jump back here to this view. Let me talk a little bit then, because part of what was interesting to me in evaluating the solar news was the fact that the prices for solar are going up so dramatically. And I've seen that in some of the evaluations that I've been doing for commercial systems, where it's not unusual to find people paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour for solar, which is, or not for solar, but for electricity. And that's pretty astounding as far as I was concerned. So, so I wanted to look into it a little bit. And before I get into that, though, I wanted to mention, I just got a notice there's a upcoming webinar that you guys might be interested in. And it's going to be on November 1st and 2nd. It's it's called Empower 2022. When I tried to do a search on that, apparently everybody who has a renewable energy conference has called it Empower. So there's about 20 of those things out there. This one is sponsored, I believe, by Aurora Solar. So if you just look up Aurora Solar and Empower for the November conference, it's free. It looked interesting, so I thought I would mention that to everybody. The web address was very hard to follow. Okay, so so how have these prices been going up? Well, as I mentioned, the average price in 2022 is 15.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So if we drill down a little bit, you can see that in 2000, the average price was about 8 cents, 8.7 cents a kilowatt hour. And as of now, it's about 15.5 cents per kilowatt hour, which seems like, you know, a really dramatic increase as we're looking at this. Although when you look at it adjusted for inflation, that's what that column is on the right, it appears that the cost is holding pretty steady. So just to be fair to the utilities there, inflation adjusted, it seems to be hanging out right at about 14 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour. I think these are in 2018 numbers, but or maybe 2021 numbers. So we're seeing dramatic increases. Of course, it varies by location. So why, when they're justifying this 15% increase in utility costs this year, what are they blaming? Well, they're blaming natural gas prices. They're blaming coal prices. They're blaming exports of natural gas. Now, I'll start taking issue with some of these. It just strikes me as when people talk about jobs, they like to blame immigrants or something. You know, it's such a small part of the picture. It's hard to imagine that import-export issues are going to really factor in. And then they're blaming the weather. So we'll take a closer look at all of these. So when we see natural gas prices have gone insane. If you look in 2020, the cost per therm for natural gas was around $2 a therm. Today, it's around $9. So basically, in the last 2 years, natural gas has quadrupled in price. This gets to one of the core issues when we talk about solar, when we're out there marketing solar out there, as you say, fossil fuels have been notoriously boom bust markets. And right now we're in a, you know, boom if you're selling, bust if you're buying. It's a very volatile energy market. So we're seeing a quadrupling of price of the raw material for natural gas in just in 2 years. The same, it's even more dramatic in coal. On March 16th, 2020, the coal per metric ton was selling for $34.05. July 25th of this year, $388. So more than a 10 times or 10-fold increase in the cost of coal. And if you're powering your electric plant with coal, now you're paying on the spot market 10 times what you're paying 2 years ago. Same with natural gas. You're paying 4 times basically what you were paying 2 years ago. So these are significant issues, and it speaks to the volatility. Now, one of the issues that we see this in pricing a lot, especially with commodities. The price kicks up, so they raise their price. Well, when the price falls back down, they don't seem to ever lower their price. So that's a bit annoying. The other issue that was raised was around import-export, and the import-export marketplace is less than 10% of the total natural gas market. So you can see from these curves here, the blue line is imports, and this brownish line is exports. And so the exports over the last year or so have exceeded imports, but to a very fractional degree. So I just don't see import-export having a consequential impact on the price of natural gas. To me, it's a red herring. They're just throwing it out there like, let's blame the foreigners, for this. And to speak to that point, if you look at actual consumption, and this speaks to the weather issue, it also speaks to import-export issues, that consumption was up for natural gas by 4.3% in 2022 versus 2021, but production was up 4.2%. So basically, there was not a dramatic mismatch between supply and demand. So they're saying, okay, there were higher demand, therefore we had to raise our prices. Well, that might be the case if you had a fixed supply or even a diminishing supply. But the fact that they were pumping more natural gas and selling more, again, I don't think that's a legitimate factor. It is a factor that the prices are going up dramatically. When I used to speak with some of these commodity traders, they would always say that 3 things affect the price of natural gas: fear, greed, and the weather. So those were the main things. And it looks like greed might be a factor here. Surprise, surprise. Another thing that I was looking at as far as price increases and are they legitimate, are they not? So I look back at 2010 and the average cost of generation, because electric prices are essentially broken into several departments as far as cost centers. There's the generation of the power, there's the transmission of the power from the power plant to the substations, basically. Then there's distribution, getting it from the substations to the customers. And then there's administration, the cost of all the office personnel, things of that nature. Then on top of that, of course, there's going to be profit margin, things like that. So in 2010, the breakdown was pretty much 6.8 cents for generation, 2.6 cents to get each kilowatt from its generating point to the customer. The price was, and that included administration, so that's cooked into that. So the price was 11.3 cents. So they had about a 1.9 cent per kilowatt hour margin. I assume in there it's profits and shareholder distributions and things like that. 2020, price for generation has declined pretty significantly to 4.6 cents. The delivery costs have gone up dramatically. Now, let's wonder why. because they really haven't invested in the infrastructure that much. And then the price is 13.2. So the margin is 4.3 cents. The margin has basically a little more than doubled in the last 10 years for electricity, while the cost of generation has declined. So in my way of thinking, there's something behind these numbers. You know, these are not really, a lot of this information is really opaque. So you can't really make strong, unless you dig in and are an industry insider. But it just kept reminding me, there was an old George Carlin routine about, you know, a penny for your thoughts, but people ask you to put your 2 cents in. So somebody's making a penny somewhere, you know, it's, somebody's making a penny somewhere in all of this. So who's making the penny is I guess the question there. One thing that they never mention, which I'm just going to throw this out, I don't want to sound like, you know, if they're willing to bash the foreigners, I'm willing to bash the CEOs. The compensation at the executive level, not just for utilities, but in all forms, inflation adjusted has increased 500% over the last decade or so, or the last 2 decades. In fact, some of the average CEOs, I've got a sheet of paper here where I've written down some of these, but you're looking at, I mean, some significant dosh here for these guys. Like NextEra's president, Tom Farrell II, his salary in 2019 was $14 million. Exelon, Christopher Crane was 15.544. The CEO of NextEra, James Robe, made a cool $22 million in annual compensation. AEP's president, Nicholas Akins, $14.5 million. So these are regulated companies. You know, it doesn't take a whole lot of management genius to make money when you're guaranteed a profit for your business. You know, I mean, that's just the way regulated companies work. And in fact, that gets to an issue here with what I view as and I put a little subheading there, cancer in the system. I think this is something really fundamentally wrong with the way that our utilities are operated. Essentially, their motivation for making money, their operating expenses, the cost of generating power, the cost of administering, the cost of delivering, that is all set in regulation. So whatever it costs them, they then set their prices and get approval for their prices to cover those costs. So there is no motivation for them. There's no profit motivation there from the delivery of electricity. There's no motivation to cut costs. There's no motivation for anything there. It's just a simple wash. Where they make their money is capital expenditures. So their motivation is to build stuff, build power plants, build, in this case, solar arrays, nuclear facilities. And the more expensive they are, the more money they make. It's because they're allowed to charge whatever the cost is plus a profit on all capital expenditures. So that's a big deal when you start thinking about where is this all going to lead, because we are in a transition period with the utility. The same way we were in a transition period in the late 1980s with the communications system. And we went from a regulated environment with Ma Bell to a deregulated environment with all of the various players, many of which we still have around today. I looked up what's the levelized cost of producing electricity currently, and these are the numbers, the industry averages after tax credits and incentives and the like. Is, remember, they're charging 15 cents, 15.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So a new coal plant is going to cost about eight and a quarter per kilowatt hour. Nuclear power plant about 8.17 if you could get approval to build it. Hydro, 6.43 cents per kilowatt hour. Wind, 4 cents, basically a kilowatt hour. Natural gas, about 4 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, I think this was before these prices spiked. And then solar, about 3.38 cents. So lowest cost is going to be solar. So you would think that that would motivate people to go and install solar, which of course it will, but they're not incentivized by what's the lowest cost. They're really incentivized by what is the overall cost, and the higher the better. So what I'd like to do is maybe spurn a little bit of discussion in this regard. These are some of the issues or some of the market concerns if I were running a utility that I would begin to worry about. There is no pricing incentives. There's no incentive to go with the low cost option. So that's a problem. But there is an incentive from your customers to try and minimize cost. So your customers have this incentive, but you don't. And historically, they've not been too concerned because they can charge whatever they can charge. And it's been a relatively stable marketplace, and their customers have paid whatever they're going to pay because they had no option. But there is much lower barriers to entry now to get into the electric utility business. Essentially, any homeowner can get into the electrical utility business by installing solar on their home. Any company can become their own utility. There may be deregulated entities. We're seeing some of that happening in California. So there is very low barrier to entry here. The price increases year in and year out seem to be baked into the system. So it's something that everybody accepts, and it is the norm. So is that going to, are the people managing the system going to want to continue that? Clearly they do. There's an incentive to build. And right now we're seeing this dramatic increase in solar. What I'm thinking is at some point in this process, the utilities have built as much as they need, but they still have an incentive to continue building. And will that momentum that's occurring at the same time as customers are building their own systems, will that result in an amazing glut of solar capacity? It's not going to happen in the next couple of years, but a decade from now, we may be talking about that we have such overcapacity of solar generating facilities out there that it's problematic. So that's something to think about. And the regulatory process is so slow. Will all of the changes in technology essentially make regulated electrical systems obsolete, similar to how they did with communications?
Hey, Jay, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Using the same, scenario with the deregulation of the telephone network, do you see that happening where, you can go and generate power, sell it to someplace else, and you pay, the owners of the lines to use their lines to get it there?
Yeah, I see that happening. It was very similar with telecommunications, where Ma Bell controlled the entire infrastructure, and then I think it was MCI sued them, wanting access to the phone network, leasing it at an appropriate lease rate so that they could then offer services to customers. And I think it was in 1987, Judge Green said, okay, AT&T or Ma Bell, you've got to open up access to your competitors because this is a public utility. I mean, the public paid for much of this through the granting of easements and things of that nature. So that sort of broke it open to where very quickly there became a regulated side of the industry and a deregulated side of the industry. And the regulated side had tremendous difficulty in competing with the deregulated side just because of the constraints that are put on them by regulation, the slowness of approval processes and things of that nature. So we may see something very similar in the utility industry where a company, and I think I've mentioned before, somebody like Apple comes out and says, I'm going to buy access to various parts of the grid, And then I am going to broker the net metered capacity of customers as a virtual power plant, and then resell that, or basically just act as a broker, almost like a PayPal for transactions amongst various customers, and you eliminate the need for a utility altogether. Clearly, somebody still has to maintain the lines, but they're being paid, so they become an infrastructure company as opposed to a vertically integrated generation, billing, infrastructure company. So yeah, I think it's going to be completely wide open. Who knows where that's all going to lead?
Jay,
Yeah.
I have two questions. One is what you just said about the solar taking over in 10 years. Do you feel that the grid can support all that? And the other question is, with the supply chain issues going on, the import of solar panels, I can see that declining because everybody's clamoring for them.
Yeah. What's happened here, and really in just the last couple of months, the Inflation Reduction Act has incentivized domestic production of all of the equipment. There's a 10% bump in your tax credit if you use domestically manufactured panels, inverters, steel, things like that. So in the industry, in all of the journals, all these manufacturers are starting to open up facilities here in the US. So there's a rush for this to happen. They're also wanting it to happen within 2 years, because in 2 years, there's the boogeyman still hanging out there of the Commerce's Department's investigation of the Southeast Asian solar panels, which could result in as much as a 200% tariff on those imported panels. So these guys are rushing to create domestic manufacturing capacity. So that's one thing. Whether they can do that at the same time as, because there's a massive rush for people to install systems. So can they keep up with demand? That's going to be an issue. And we don't know that until it happens. As far as can the grid handle solar, I guess you're talking about the intermittency of solar. And there's also a rush to incorporate battery storage into.
What I was talking about more so is like what happened in California, where Newsom, mandated to charge the cars at night, but he's pushing for electrical vehicles.
Yeah.
Because the grid can't handle it.
Well, and that's because capacity. Yeah,
Right.
the capacity of the grid. Well, in fact, I was on the way this morning coming in here, I was listening to a podcast called Factor This, and they were interviewing the head of the FERC. And she was essentially saying how the transmission lines in the US have been neglected. They're anticipating that by the year 2030, they'll have to essentially double the transmission capacity within the US. And there is government money that's been allocated through the Infrastructure Act that was passed last year to do just that. But then she said between 2030 and 2050, it needs to quadruple again. So we're really looking at, what would that end up being? An eight times factor between now and 2050. So transmission is a big deal. But the other issue to consider is if you're going with localized distributed, say, microgrids, local power generation, you actually reduce the capacity requirements of your local grid. When you add solar to your home, you're no longer drawing power, all the power that you're using, from a power plant through the infrastructure of the grid. So the more solar we add in a distributed manner, then the less burden is placed on the grid, except during emergencies, at which point that could exacerbate it. Yeah, Eric?
I had a question about that. So, just kind of electrical principle. If I have a solar garden and I'm selling that electricity, putting it back in the grid, does it flow to the nearest houses first?
Yeah, basically to the next load. Yeah, so it would flow to your next door neighbor pretty much. But again, all of this is kind of a virtual marketplace because you don't care which electron you buy. You know, power's going onto the grid, power's coming off of the grid. Now we just need to account for it somewhere or the other. So, you know, even though you're contributing it to your local system, say that's AEP or somebody like that, you could actually be selling your excess electricity through Apple, and Ed could be buying that through the Apple iPay or iPower account that he's got on his phone. It's not going to be your electron, but it'll be accounted for as power going in, power going out. Okay, yeah, Jay?
Do you envision that having closed system residential solar charging up batteries in the garage so you can charge your car overnight from your battery and be able to do that off grid?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense technically to charge a battery to charge a battery. You know, I mean, I would imagine you just charge your battery directly. You know, I think it makes more sense to use your electric car as your battery. That makes infinite sense to me.
But we keep the demand off the grid for the car.
Yeah, it's just what you're getting at there is it's not so much, it's always about time. You know, what time is the demand required, not so much how much demand is required. I could see people having both, I guess, batteries and an electric vehicle, but it would be more just how much capacity do you want in reserve? Technically, you could charge from one battery to another, but it's a pretty inefficient way to do it. I don't see that as my first choice, but people have been inefficient in the past and managed to make it work.
Have you heard about this hydrogen technology where they use solar to bring hydrogen out of the air vapor and then use that when solar's in excess, and then you have it to run generators?
Yeah, I mean, I've never been a big advocate of hydrogen for a number of reasons. One is the fact that electrolysis as a way of doing it is pretty inefficient. You know, so if you're using energy just for the sole purpose of converting to hydrogen, it's not very economic. And also storage of hydrogen can be problematic because it's such a small molecule. It tends to leak through metal containers. It's got to be highly pressurized or liquefied or something of that nature. But that said, then what you're alluding to there, Meg, is that when we do have overcapacity of wind and solar, you know, currently all they do is curtail the system. They just shut it down. We don't need that on the grid. So the wind turbines stop spinning, the solar panels are not producing. So why not take that energy that would not be harvested and use that to create hydrogen and store that hydrogen? Now, the question there is that less expensive than simply installing batteries and storing the power in the form of a battery? Currently not really, but could the liquefied hydrogen or the hydrogen be converted into, for instance, a jet fuel, a hydrogen-based jet fuel type situation where batteries don't work? You know, you need the energy density of a fuel. Could you make jet fuel through hydrogen or something like that? And I think that's a viable option in very specific, maybe also use it for industrial purposes, you know, things that require highly concentrated energy, and batteries are just not a good option. So I think we'll see some of that evolving, but as part of the grid, strikes me kind of maybe not, but I mean, this is the fun part about it. Everything's changing. I mean, everything is so dramatically changing in this industry, where we're moving to an electrify everything mode. You know, electric vehicles are going to be the thing, electric heating, electric air conditioning. If we have an overabundance of renewables, it becomes almost free. Question is, though, will utilities, when I look at this energy future, it's all very positive, except utilities are incentivized not to make that happen. You know, they're incentivized to keep costs high, to keep supply centrally coordinated, and to keep getting $25 million a year salaries. You know, I mean, that's their incentive. So what's the end result? You know, I don't see them changing their incentive system. So I think we're just going to bust up the utilities. You know, I think it's just it's going to fracture, and it's not going to go away, just like, you know, because there needs to be somebody maintaining the infrastructure. But I think that will become the role of the utility, is to basically become, you know, an infrastructure maintenance vehicle. The generation will be handled by other investors. The billing processes, all of that will be integrated in with services as opposed to with commodity. So everybody will just pay rent to the utility for maintaining the infrastructure. But the infrastructure, you know, we're going to have a lot of localized infrastructure, a lot of microgrids. So there will be private infrastructure integrating in with the broader infrastructure. And this is all going to happen really fast. I think that's something that I don't think we're really, at least haven't really internalized yet, is the US manufacturing stuff is going to happen in the next 2 years, you know? So we're going to go from like nothing to 50% of all panels coming from the US in 2 years. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean a spike in prices because our price point is so high? Or does it mean a lowering in prices because they come up with innovative technologies that don't require silicon because the silicon process can't keep up? You know, I mean, when you're talking about creating solar panels, there's several things. You got to mine the silicon, you got to make the ingots, you've got to make the cells, and you got to make the modules. Well, the making of the modules is the easiest part. The making of the cells from the ingots, probably the second easiest. You know, each time it goes deeper. And right now, I think about 87% of the silicon comes from China. So how do we transition that in 2 years? I mean, that ain't going to happen. So what do? Do you come up with other technologies? Does perovskite suddenly become the dominant technology in solar? Which would be amazing because the cost of manufacturing a perovskite panel is 1/10 that of the cost of manufacturing a silicon panel. So, you know, who knows? Maybe solar panels drop to 5 cents a kilowatt, you know, or 5 cents a watt very quickly. So who knows? Any other insights other than my random thoughts that are uninformed by any knowledge?
I heard Meg talk about the hydrogen. Just to get a little bit of information in Trinidad, there's a company in the United States called KBR. I don't know if you ever heard about it, but they were commissioned to do a hydrogen study in Trinidad and Tobago, which is currently underway. It is being financed by the IDB, which is the Inter-American Development Bank. So that is something they're doing in Trinidad at the moment.
Oh, yeah. Well, one of the motivations with hydrogen, and another reason I've been sour on it for so long, is it really has been pushed by the fossil fuel industry, largely because most hydrogen comes from natural gas. You know, we're always told we just take water vapor or water and we have H2O and you get hydrogen and you've got oxygen and that's the only thing. Well, it doesn't work that way. It's very inefficient. So what they do is they use natural gas, which is something, I think its molecular structure is like C6H6 or something like that. So you get a lot of hydrogen out of it, but then the pollutant out of that is carbon dioxide, you know, which is a greenhouse gas. So you're taking a fossil fuel, making it into hydrogen, giving off greenhouse gases, and maintaining a central control of the energy source. So it doesn't really solve the problem. But that said, things change, you know. I'm high on hydrogen jet fuel. So or co-locating industrial facilities next to wind turbine farms. Why not? When you have extra capacity, make your fuel. When you don't have extra capacity, well, you've stored the fuel for the next time. So,
Jay,
yeah.
with the hydrogen jet fuel, aren't you going to have to go through the process of making that into a syngas and then basically making the fuel? It's not, you can't really run a plane on hydrogen.
No, I don't think so. I don't know. I don't know anything about that other than I think it's probably theoretically possible, but if it's economically possible, practical, I don't know. And as just an example, but I think there is probably a use for hydrogen that's not currently being explored.
Freighters, I heard also.
What is it? Freighters? Oh,
yeah. But, ships might be able to have their own generation on board and.
Oh, from the water and all. That's possible.
Or from water vapor, air vapor.
Yeah.
And they could have solar, but then of course they can't sail at night.
Yeah, one of the primary uses for hydrogen in energy production has historically been through fuel cells. And fuel cells have their own problem, one of which is that they're incredibly heavy. And they use a lot of materials like platinum, which make them very expensive. So the traditional fuel cell vehicle has been a bus because it can handle the size and the weight, but a freighter would certainly be able to do that as well. Use fuel cells to operate because the weight is not as big an issue. So anyway, all right. Anything else for the good of the cause before we call it a day here? A lot of speculation there. It'll be interesting. We're in for an interesting decade. So, all right. Sorry about the technical problems at the beginning. We'll see you all next week.